The ocean had always been their bond. To outsiders, it looked like a father teaching his boy how to fish, but for Daniel Harper and his 15-year-old son Michael, the water was more than a pastime. It was the language of their family. Daniel was a fisherman by trade, hardened by years of sun and salt, a man who measured time by tides instead of calendars. Michael, wide-eyed and eager, wasn't yet hardened by the sea's cruelty. To him, it was a place of adventure, where horizons seemed endless and anything felt possible. The morning of their final trip began like any other. The sun rose quietly over the harbor, painting the water in muted gold. Locals waved as Daniel and Michael loaded gear into their modest vessel, a small craft they called the Marlin. For most, it was just another Saturday, another day chasing fish. For the Harpers, it was a tradition, father and son against the vast blue unknown. Daniel moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this his entire life. He checked the nets, tightened the ropes, inspected the fuel lines. Michael carried rods and bait, humming a tune under his breath, too young to feel the weight of routine. They laughed as seagulls circled overhead, snatching scraps before the boat even left the dock. To those watching, it was an ordinary departure, nothing remarkable, nothing to remember. At least, not yet. Out past the breakers, the sea looked calm, deceptively calm. Swells lifted the boat gently, rocking like a cradle. Michael leaned against the bow, hair whipping in the breeze, while his father steered with steady hands. But beyond the horizon, dark clouds were forming, silent, slow-moving, unseen by most eyes in the harbor. The weather report spoke of shifting fronts and possible squalls in the Outer Banks, the kind of phrasing fishermen learned to respect. Daniel heard the radio chatter but brushed it aside. Storms came and went. He had seen worse, and besides, he wasn't planning to stay long. Just another routine trip, just one more day on the water with his son. What no one knew, not Daniel, not Michael, not the people waving from the pier, was that this departure would be their last. The ocean was waiting, as it always does, patient, silent, hungry. The Marlin was no stranger to the sea. She was a 22-foot fiberglass vessel with a weather-beaten hull and an outboard motor that coughed before it roared to life. Built for near-shore fishing, she wasn't fragile, but she wasn't built for punishment either. Her size made her nimble in calm waters, but out in the deep against the wrong storm, she was little more than driftwood waiting to snap. Daniel knew her limits. He had patched her leaks, painted her deck, kept her alive longer than most men would bother. To him, the boat was dependable, like an old friend. Michael loved her for different reasons. To him, she was freedom. On board, he wasn't just a boy. He was a sailor, an adventurer, the kind of man he hoped to become. That morning, Daniel pushed her harder than usual. Reports of bigger fish offshore had reached the docks earlier in the week. Tuna were running farther out, past the safe zones most small boats respected. The promise of a heavier catch was enough to tempt him. More fish meant more money, and more money meant a better life for Michael. They left the comfort of familiar reefs and pushed into open water, chasing rumors on the horizon. The sky was still clear above them, but the deeper they went, the stranger the air felt. Humid, heavy, thick in a way seasoned fishermen notice without saying a word. Michael was oblivious, casting lines with boyish excitement. Every tug, every ripple was a thrill. Daniel smiled at his son's enthusiasm, but his eyes lingered on the horizon. He saw what others would call nothing, just a faint smudge of gray far away. To him, it was a warning. Back on shore, other fishermen muttered about pressure changes, about gulls flying inland earlier than usual. "The weather's turning," one old salt said, shaking his head. But warnings have a way of sounding like superstition until it's too late. Out at sea, the Harpers pressed on, unaware that each mile carried them further from safety. The fish they sought would remain unseen, and the storm they ignored was already gathering strength. Out there in the deep, The line between man and memory grows thin. The radio room at the Coast Guard station was quiet that night, a low hum of static filling the space between routine weather updates and fishing chatter. Then, just after 9 p.m., a voice cut through the noise. It was Daniel Harper's, strained, urgent, broken by static. "We're taking on water." And then nothing. The words hung in the air, incomplete, swallowed by the crackle of interference. The operator repeated the call sign, asked for coordinates, for clarification, for anything. Silence answered back. The operator logged the entry, time-stamped it, and escalated to superiors. In small coastal towns, word travels faster than the tide. Within an hour, every fisherman in the harbor knew something was wrong. Wives paced kitchens, hands trembling as they checked clocks and phones. Children peeked out windows, waiting for headlights that never came. Daniel and Michael had been expected back before dusk, their trips rarely lasting past sundown. Now the horizon was empty, the sea black, and the harbor eerily still. The Coast Guard dispatched a patrol vessel, its spotlight sweeping the swells in long arcs, but found only restless water. The storm that had loomed on the horizon had finally reached the coast, rolling in with sheets of rain and winds that howled through rigging lines. Radios buzzed with speculation. Some swore they'd seen the Marlin earlier that evening, further out than she should have been. Others whispered about engine trouble, a failing bilge pump, signs Daniel might have ignored in his determination to chase a better catch. By midnight, the harbor had transformed. Cars lined the pier, headlights facing the water. Mothers clutched blankets against the cold while old-timers muttered prayers under their breath. Everyone listened for the hum of an engine returning, for a horn in the fog, for any proof the father and son had beaten the storm. But all that came was silence. Thick, endless silence. The ocean had spoken once through a broken radio call, then gone quiet, as if it had already decided their fate. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a restless gray sea. The Coast Guard wasted no time. A cutter swept out first, engines thundering, crews scanning with binoculars as the sun rose over rolling waves. Helicopters joined soon after, their blades chopping the morning air, spotlights skimming the water for any trace of wreckage. The search grid expanded quickly, covering dozens of nautical miles. Each sweep brought hope, then disappointment. No boat, no debris. Not even an oil slick to suggest where the Marlin had gone down. Volunteer fishermen joined in, their own small boats venturing beyond safe waters, hearts heavy but determined. They knew the sea's patterns, its hidden currents, the places where wrecks sometimes surfaced days later. Radios crackled constantly, reports of a floating cooler, a piece of wood, a gull circling low. Each sighting drew boats rushing, only to find false hope adrift in the tide. On shore, the harbor became a vigil. Families gathered with binoculars and thermoses of coffee, eyes fixed on the horizon. Every returning boat sent a ripple of anticipation through the crowd, only to be followed by the slump of despair when searchers shook their heads. The Coast Guard extended the search into the night. Spotlights cut through darkness, illuminating waves that looked like endless fields of shifting black. The roar of helicopter rotors echoed over the town, a haunting reminder that time was slipping away. 48 hours passed. Then 72. Still nothing. No flare sighted, no life raft deployed, no voice on the radio. The sea had offered no explanation, only questions. And with each empty sweep, those questions grew darker. Had the Marlin gone down intact, trapping father and son inside? Had the storm carried them so far off course that the search was looking in the wrong place? Or had the ocean simply claimed them in silence, leaving nothing behind at all? By the fourth day, the official reports grew grim. No debris recovered, no bodies located, presumed lost at sea. But in the harbor, where families still clung to hope, the silence of the ocean felt more like a secret waiting to be uncovered. For Sarah Harper, the silence was worse than grief. Grief has an end point, a service, a casket, a place to leave flowers. Silence is endless. Every night she stood on the shoreline, the cold sand biting her feet, staring at a horizon that gave nothing back. She clutched Michael's jacket, still faintly smelling of salt and detergent, as if holding it tight might pull her son home again. Their small house on the hill became a shrine to absence. 2 chairs at the kitchen table sat untouched. Fishing boots by the back door remained neatly lined, waiting for footsteps that would never return. Neighbors brought casseroles, whispered prayers, offered help with chores, but none of it filled the void. The phone sat heavy on the counter, every ring a lightning bolt of hope that always ended in disappointment. At first, Sarah clung to faith. The Coast Guard was searching, volunteers were combing the waters, and Daniel was no stranger to the sea. If anyone could survive, it was him. And Michael. He was strong, young, a good swimmer. Surely they'd be found, clinging to driftwood, dehydrated but alive. Days bled into weeks. Each morning, Sarah walked the pier, her eyes scanning every boat returning from the horizon. Children from town left flowers on the dock, drawings of Michael taped to lampposts, crayon suns smiling above blue waves. The community rallied, holding candlelight vigils, praying for safe return. But as the weeks stretched on, hope began to fracture. Conversations shifted from when to if. Some avoided Sarah's eyes in the grocery store, guilt etched on their faces, as if they had already buried her family in their minds. The search was scaled back, then suspended. Sarah was left with only questions, unanswered and unbearable. Every night she replayed the same thought. If Daniel had never gone out so far, if Michael had never begged to go along, if she had just said no. But the ocean doesn't answer what-ifs. It only takes, and then it keeps. In towns built on the edge of the sea, mysteries never stay quiet. The Harpers' disappearance became a story retold in bait shops, whispered in bars, carried like driftwood from one conversation to another. Some swore the storm had capsized them, dragging boat and bodies to the ocean floor. Others suggested foul play, pirates, smugglers, maybe men who didn't want witnesses to whatever business was happening offshore. More chilling whispers painted darker possibilities. Old-timers said they'd seen Daniel looking tired, worn down by bills and the grind of fishing that never paid enough. Maybe he wanted to disappear, they muttered, lowering their voices. Maybe he took the boy and started over somewhere else. For some, it explained the radio call, a staged message, a cover to mask escape. But others scoffed. Daniel was a proud man, stubborn, not a dreamer. He would never abandon his wife, never put his son through such a cruel deception. Still, the rumors persisted, feeding fires of speculation whenever the harbor went quiet. As years passed, the story shifted from tragedy to legend. Teenagers told it like a ghost tale, how the Marlin sailed into the storm and never came back, how some nights you could hear a radio crackle out at sea, repeating that broken call for help. Tourists bought into the lore, asking about the lost father and son, pointing at the pier as if the story were part of the town's attractions. For Sarah, the rumors were knives. She heard them at church picnics, in whispered tones at the market. Each theory, storm, foul play, deliberate vanishing, tore open wounds that never closed. She lived in a limbo where everyone had an answer, but no one had the truth. The official records were clear, lost at sea. But in the minds of the community, the Harpers became something more. A cautionary tale, a mystery unsolved, a story too strange, too haunting, to ever truly let go. And in that silence, the legend of the Harpers began to grow, waiting for the sea to speak again. After 3 weeks of fruitless searching, the Coast Guard made its announcement. The Harpers were gone. The words were delivered in a press briefing that lasted less than 5 minutes, clinical, precise, and devastating. No survivors, presumed lost at sea. Just like that, the case was closed. The ocean granted its silence. Death certificates were issued to Sarah. The papers arrived in a plain envelope, stamped and signed, as if bureaucracy could define finality. She held them in her hands, staring at the black ink that declared her husband and son dead. But how could ink speak for bodies never recovered, for voices never silenced in her heart? The house grew quieter after that. Friends stopped visiting as often, their well-meaning sympathy giving way to an awkward distance. The casseroles stopped coming. The vigils dwindled. Life in the town moved forward, but Sarah remained anchored in place, tethered to memories she couldn't let drift away. She never changed the locks on the door. She kept Michael's room exactly as he had left it. Posters on the wall, homework on the desk, a baseball glove resting by the window. She couldn't bring herself to erase him, not when the ocean had already stolen so much. In the harbor, the Marlin slip sat empty, the ropes dangling uselessly into the tide. Some fishermen avoided looking at it altogether, while others glanced every time they passed, as if expecting Daniel and Michael to return, smiling, hauling in nets full of fish. But the sea gave no answers, only the occasional reminder of its cruelty, a piece of driftwood mistaken for wreckage, a life jacket that belonged to someone else. Eventually, the Harpers' story faded from headlines, folded into the town's folklore. But for Sarah, there was no closure, only a hollow decree stamped by officials who had never known her son's laugh or her husband's stubborn pride. The sea had swallowed her family whole, and it had no intention of giving them back. 25 years passed like waves eroding stone. The town aged, storefronts changed hands, new families moved in. Children who once lit candles at vigils grew up, started their own families, and told their kids about the father and son who vanished at sea. The Harpers became more legend than memory, a story told to tourists with the same inflection reserved for ghost tales. Sarah aged quietly, her hair silvered, her steps slowed, but she never left the house by the hill, the one with the view of the horizon. Neighbors said she still walked the pier some evenings, her eyes searching waters that had long since stopped being searched by anyone else. Officially, the mystery was over. Unofficially, it had never ended. Then, in the summer of the 25th year, the sea stirred again. A commercial trawler out of a neighboring port was dragging its nets along a trench. Few boats dared to fish. Deep waters known for tangled lines and unpredictable swells. The fishermen expected a heavy catch of cod. Instead, the net snagged something solid, something heavy enough to threaten tearing the rigging apart. At first, they thought it was rock, maybe an old engine block swallowed years ago. But when they hauled it to the surface, rusted metal broke through the waves. Bent, barnacle-encrusted but unmistakable, the skeletal remains of a small boat's hull. Silence fell across the deck. No one spoke as they cut away seaweed and debris, revealing faded paint beneath the rust. Letters, warped but still visible, spelling a name, the Marlin. The deckhands exchanged uneasy glances, their excitement at the find twisted into dread. The ocean had given something back, but it was not mercy. It was memory, long buried and heavy with secrets. The trawler turned for shore, dragging behind it not just wreckage, but a story the town had tried to bury. After 25 years of silence, the sea was ready to speak again, and what it had to say would be more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The sea is full of ghosts, and fishermen know it better than anyone. Still, nothing prepared the crew of the Seafarer for what their nets dragged from the depths that day. At first it was the weight that caught their attention, too heavy, too solid, resisting the winch with an unnatural pull. The deckhands grunted, straining as chains rattled and ropes creaked, expecting to see a mass of rock or scrap metal tangled in seaweed. When the shape broke the surface, silence spread across the deck. It wasn't an engine block. It wasn't rock. It was twisted metal, coated in rust and barnacles, the unmistakable curvature of a boat's hull. The ocean had been eating it for years, but the bones of the vessel remained, stubborn and grim. One man crossed himself. Another muttered under his breath, "God help us." They hauled it closer, waves slapping against the warped frame. Paint peeled in flakes, but beneath the rust, faded letters were barely legible, stretched and broken by years of salt water. An M, then an A. And then the rest of the name appeared like a whisper from the past. Marlin. The crew froze. The legend had been dredged from the deep, tangible, and terrible. The father and son who had vanished a generation earlier had never left. They had been here all along, waiting beneath the surface. The captain radioed the Coast Guard, his voice shaking as he relayed the impossible. By the time the seafarer returned to port, the harbor was already buzzing. Word spread like wildfire. The Marlin had been found. Families poured onto the pier, older now, weathered by time but still carrying the weight of memories. Cameras flashed, news crews assembled, and children whispered to each other, wide-eyed. The wreck, lashed to the trawler's side, seemed to drip history with every wave. The outline of the hull was broken, warped from years of pressure in the trench, but the shape was unmistakable. The Marlin had returned. Yet even as it surfaced, one truth became clear. Ships don't come back from the deep without carrying pieces of their story. And the Marlin was about to reveal hers. The wreck was towed into a secure dock under Coast Guard supervision. Divers in black wetsuits circled the remains, their flashlights cutting through the brine as they documented the vessel's condition. To everyone's shock, the cold waters had preserved more than expected. The cabin was partially intact, sealed long enough to keep out the worst of the ocean's appetite. When the first diver emerged, his mask fogged and his eyes wide, he carried a small bundle in his hands. A waterlogged jacket, the fabric stiff but recognizable. Inside its pocket, a fishing license still bore Daniel Harper's name. The crowd on shore gasped, whispers rippling like the tide. More artifacts followed. Fishing rods corroded but intact. A tackle box with rusted hinges. And then something achingly human, a plastic bag, sealed tightly, inside of which lay a photograph. Blurred by moisture but unmistakable, the image showed Daniel, Sarah, and Michael on the pier. A family portrait frozen in time, trapped in the dark for a quarter of a century. But with the familiar came the unsettling. Beneath the deck, divers found claw-like scratches etched into the wood, desperate marks that told a story of panic. A flashlight, long dead, lay near the cabin hatch, as if someone had tried to signal through darkness that never answered. And deeper still, they found the first sign of remains, skeletal fragments tangled in collapsed timbers. It was impossible to tell at first whose they were, but the bones carried the weight of finality. The sea had not only taken the Harpers, it had kept their last moments, locked inside the hull like a coffin. Officials ordered the wreck sealed, transported under heavy guard for forensic analysis. But the whispers had already begun, louder than the roar of the cranes lifting the wreck. This was no ordinary sinking. The evidence suggested struggle, desperation, choices made in the final hours that no family ever wants to imagine. The boat had returned, but with it came a new tide of questions, and what waited inside was only the beginning. The true horror waited below. Forensic divers, steady in their movements but rattled by the weight of the moment, descended into the cabin of the Marlin. Their flashlights swept through the shadows, beams slicing across warped wood and half-collapsed beams. There, amidst the silt and debris, bones lay scattered like secrets finally exhaled. The skeletal remains were fragile, discolored by decades underwater. Some were wedged between timbers, others tangled in netting that had collapsed with the ceiling. Forensic experts marked each piece, bagging them carefully, the silence of the work only broken by the hiss of their air tanks. Yet it wasn't the bones alone that told the story. The seating arrangement below deck hinted at something more human, more tragic. One set of remains was found near the stern, hunched low as if the person had tried to shield themselves, to curl against the hull for protection. Another lay closer to the steps, suggesting movement, a struggle against inevitability. It painted a picture of final moments spent not in unity, but in separation, one hiding, the other fighting against the storm. As the divers worked, one of them noticed something strange near the wooden paneling. Etched into the planks were markings, rough, uneven lines that at first seemed random, but under the beam of a flashlight they became clear. Words, carved by a shaking hand, gouged into the surface with desperate force. The letters were shallow in some places, deeper in others, as if scratched by a knife or even bare metal. The team photographed the discovery, then rose to the surface, shaken by what they had seen. The ocean had held more than bones. It had kept a voice, locked in wood, waiting for someone to listen. When the wreck was hauled into dry dock, investigators and forensic analysts moved in under tight security. Word of the inscription spread quickly through official channels, though at first it was kept from the public. Rumors alone were enough to set the town buzzing. Then, when photographs were finally released, the world saw what the divers had glimpsed beneath the hull. 2 words carved into splintered wood. "Forgive me, son." The message was uneven, jagged, the letters hacked out with urgency. The edges of the carving were darkened, as if the wood had been scored again and again, until the words could not be mistaken. To investigators, it was the most haunting clue of all. Theories erupted immediately. Had Daniel Harper, the father, written it in his final hours? If so, what did he mean? Was it guilt for bringing Michael on the trip at all, knowing the storm was dangerous? Was it an admission of failure, a father apologizing for not saving his son? Or was it something darker, that Daniel had made a decision in those final moments, one that doomed the boy in order to prolong his own survival? Theories spread like wildfire, each more chilling than the last. In kitchens and coffee shops, locals whispered possibilities. A fight for the last life jacket, a choice to save one at the expense of the other, or something unknowable, locked forever in those 2 words. Sarah, now an old woman, refused to believe anything sinister. "He loved that boy," she told reporters, her voice trembling. Whatever he wrote, it wasn't malice. It was grief. But others weren't so sure. The words remained carved into the boat like a scar, a father's confession left in the darkness of a sinking ship. Forgiveness for what? That question would echo louder than the storm itself, haunting those who read it, long after the wreck was found. The inscription sent shockwaves far beyond the harbor town. Experts were summoned. Marine archaeologists, forensic psychologists, even criminologists, to weigh in on the meaning of 2 words carved into the wood. "Forgive me, son." Simple, devastating, and endlessly interpretable. Some experts argued it was the act of a desperate father, a final plea for understanding. Perhaps Daniel Harper had given Michael the only chance at survival, forcing him onto higher ground, handing him the last vestige of safety, or even sacrificing his own position below deck to protect the boy. To them, the message was love carved into wood, a father's last act immortalized. Others, however, read it differently. They pointed to the separation of the remains, the father near the steps, the boy huddled deeper below, as evidence of division, maybe even conflict. Did Daniel feel guilty for a decision he made in those frantic hours? Was it something irreversible, something Michael couldn't forgive in life? A fight for resources, for breath, for survival? Rumors outside the official circles went darker still. Whispers surfaced about Daniel's debts, old loans owed to men who didn't forgive late payments. Some wondered if the Marlin had been carrying more than fishing gear, if Daniel had gotten tangled in smuggling routes that cut through those waters. Could sabotage have played a role, the storm only finishing what had already been set in motion? Others dismissed the idea as pure legend. townsfolk twisting tragedy into conspiracy to explain the unexplainable. But the theories wouldn't stop. Each newspaper article, each broadcast feature added fuel to the fire. Was Daniel Harper a hero, a coward, or something far more complicated, a man crushed under the weight of the sea, his choices carved into wood for strangers to argue about decades later? The storm had taken father and son, but the inscription ensured their story would never truly rest. When Sarah Harper was shown the inscription, she sat quietly, her frail hands folded in her lap. At 80 years old, she had carried the weight of absence for a quarter of a century, living each day with questions the sea refused to answer. Now, at last, she had something tangible, a message left behind, though it brought as much pain as relief. Reporters gathered outside her home, hungry for her reaction. She spoke softly, her voice worn by years of silence. He wasn't asking for forgiveness because he hurt Michael. He was asking because he couldn't save him to Sarah. The words were not a confession of guilt, but an apology born of love. She refused to let speculation taint the memory of her husband or her son. In her eyes, Daniel had faced an impossible storm and left behind the only words he could, sorrow carved into wood for a boy he adored. Yet the discovery reopened wounds she had worked decades to scar over. Old grief flooded back with fresh force. She looked at the photo recovered from the wreck, the three of them smiling on the pier, sunlight dancing on the water, and her hands shook. "That was my family," she whispered. "That's who they were, not the stories people tell." The town watched her closely, some siding with her conviction, others unable to silence their doubts. But Sarah clung fiercely to her version of the truth. To her, the carving was not about guilt or betrayal, it was love in its most desperate form. And though the wreck had returned with bones and questions, she chose to see it as closure, not curse. For the first time in 25 years, she could say goodbye. Even if the sea had swallowed the details, she had decided what mattered. Daniel had loved his son until the end, and in those 2 words she believed he had loved him still. The wreck of the Marlin was hauled from the water and placed in dry dock, but it never truly left the sea. Its corroded frame, its splintered wood, its whispered message, all of it belonged to the deep. For 25 years the ocean had kept its secret, holding father and son in silence, burying their story in salt and darkness. And when it finally chose to return them, it was not in mercy, but in fragments, bones, artifacts, and words carved by a trembling hand. The town wrestled with its legacy. To some, the discovery was closure, a way to bury ghosts that had haunted the shoreline for decades. To others, it was only a new chapter of questions, a reminder that the sea never explains, it only hints. The boat itself became both coffin and confession, a grave preserved in salt water and a message in a bottle sent across a quarter-century of tides. Inside its warped hull, you could read tragedy etched into every surface, the claw marks, the waterlogged photograph, the desperate inscription left behind. Yet, beyond the forensic reports and theories, one truth remained unshaken. The sea had chosen when to speak, and it had spoken in its own language of ruin and revelation. On the pier, Sarah Harper stood one last time, her silver hair caught in the wind. She watched the wreck from a distance, refusing to step closer. For her, the sea had already taken enough. She closed her eyes and listened to the waves. To her, they did not sound cruel. They sounded eternal. The ocean did not care for legends or debates. It had swallowed the Harpers in one breath and held them in its chest for a generation, only to exhale them when it pleased. That was its way. That would always be its way. In the end, the mystery of what truly happened aboard the Marlin would remain locked between the swells and the silence, known only to the father and son who faced the storm together. The sea had taken them, And then it had returned what it wanted the world to see: fragments, artifacts, questions without answers. The rest it kept, as it keeps so many things, because the ocean never forgets. It only waits to return what it has taken. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.